Like I learned about it from Professor Larry Gibson, who's one of my law professors at University of Maryland, Carey School of Law. He had a really interesting class called Maryland Law and the History of Segregation. Professor Gibson gave me Diggs v. Morgan College. This story starts around 1910, doesn't close out until this thing goes on for about 7 to 8 years. The popular law firm back then, Piper and Marbury, the named partner was involved in crafting the original law that made it illegal for black schools and black houses and black businesses to be on the same block as majority white spaces. The more I read about the story, the more I was intrigued by the fact that these people were not angered by the fact that they were building a black school. They looked at their confines and saw, all of these houses, and they saw the evolution of a black community in their midst. My father had joined the Laurelville Improvement Association. My father never knew this story. When you read the Sun paper articles, there are like 30 or 40 articles about this thing in the paper. And they started writing about a black invasion. I'm sorry, not a black invasion, a Negro invasion. The Afro-American newspaper writes the equivalent of about 4 or 5 articles in 7 years. They don't want to bring attention to this. So this idea that living in close proximity to black people had been a thing for over 100, 150 years. First thing about Morgan is when they move into Laurelville, Morgan is a nuisance. So there are 4 particular families that file a lawsuit. Anything within Baltimore City is a no-go because of the 1910 ordinance. Board of Trustees at Morgan began to do is look for places right on the other side of the Baltimore City line. And Laurelville, at that point in time, was on the other side of the city line. And so they looked at more than 50 sites, in and around the city. They were actually guided by the mayor to go into these old spaces that the city really wasn't interested in. Why don't you so there was all these notions of let's store you someplace where nobody sees you, where they're not a nuisance. After the 1904 fire, when property values began to skyrocket, anywhere where black people move is a nuisance because it drives down property values. And so that's what the folks out here were really anxious about. The systematic elements were telling them that if black people moved into their neighborhood, then they were going to lose property value. But the lawsuit focuses mostly on the board members exceeding their charter and going outside of the educational realm and doing something that they were not supposed to do, and that was build. They could educate, but not build. Baltimore's hyper-segregated at the early part of the 20th century. There's only a handful of black neighborhoods, and they're isolated, they're tightly woven, and guess what? None of them are out here. I think the idea that even if black people were successful building the school, that they would go back to their own neighborhoods and live in their own neighborhoods and then commute out here. And the natural evolution of the lawsuit is the thing that the Laurelville community feared most, actually happened. They had to build 165 residential units. They literally split the campus, the back part of the campus off, and built the whole communities for the instructors and for the administrators who were living in the neighborhood. Within that same time frame, Harry O'Neill Wilson owned some property up off of York Road near Alameda and Cold Spring, buys up a lot of the property up that way. It's World War I in 1917. There's a lot of anti-German sentiment, and this is an African-American land speculator taking advantage of that. And so he buys buys quite a bit of property, literally a couple of miles up the street, because he knows that Morgan is going to need more than 165 dwellings. And so you have Morgan Park and Wilson Park that are literally some of the first suburbs for African Americans in the entire country, built specifically for them, but for the purpose of education, right? And mutual benefit, right? Community development and that kind of thing. And these places are still hallmark communities today. Baltimore was a learning laboratory for these laws all over the country. America, cities would pass some 30 to 40 laws similar to this in different cities. And the only thing that changed in the Baltimore language, in Baltimore's legal language, was the name of the city. By 1918, this is becoming part of the American ethos. The law is passed in 1910. Morgan tries to buy property in 1913. The law stays in the court systems until 1917. It's overturned in, I think, in 1918. Morgan won the lawsuit. This lawsuit went to appeal. Laurville Improvement Association loses. Morgan, ironically, that land, the Ivy Mill property and the Morton property, are part of Laurville at that point, before then. That now gets excised from the community and becomes its own different community. In 1917, Morgan Park and Morgan College become its own isolated community. And that would not, I think they would reconcile like a few years ago. I did the presentation of the facts up at Morgan, and I invited the Laurville Improvement Association, right? She came on and more or less talked about how Laurville felt about that circumstance at that point in time. And that made, I have pictures of it, that made the front page of the Baltimore Sun.